I now want to bring in Monique Dixon, Deputy Policy Director from the NAACP, Mark Claxton, a former NYPD detective and Director of the Black Law Enforcement Alliance, DeRay McKesson, an organizer for the Black Lives Matter movement and a former mayoral candidate in Baltimore, as well as Stephen Loomis, President of the Cleveland Police Patrolmen's Association. This is what we call a power panel on this issue, ladies and gentlemen. Let me start with you, Monique, of what you just heard from the commissioner and what it means to have this agreement go into force.
Well, we are pleased that the federal judge decided to approve the consent decree. For the past 2 years, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund has worked very closely with community members in Baltimore to assist with providing the Justice Department with additional evidence of unlawful policing practices in Baltimore City. We've worked with the police department as well. You know, many years of efforts have gone unaddressed in Baltimore City. You know, the police department has tried to reform itself and has been unsuccessful over the years, and it is the strong view of residents of Baltimore City that federal intervention is warranted and necessary in this particular case.
Right, and this has always been the big question, which is when the feds come in, does it help? DeRay, take a listen to a simplification of these issues that came up on Bill Maher.
What Jeff Sessions has said, he's never been a fan of these, is that they're essentially walking away from them. And the irony here is that the Department of Justice is saying that they're not invested in police reform. Meanwhile, the police departments themselves are very much invested in it.
Sure.
And so in Ferguson, for instance,
it sounds
in Chicago,
like just a big you to Black Lives Matter.
Oh, that's pretty much what it is.
DeRay, is that right? And what do you make of, obviously, a 180 change here at the DOJ?
Yeah, I think that the administration has been clear that they have no commitment to issues of equity, justice, and definitely not race. We know that the federal government has been an important party in intervening to ensure that civil rights are held at the state level, that states left to their own devices have never been good on these issues. You think about the Voting Rights Act, and I'm reminded that the consent decrees wouldn't be necessary if there had not already been an established pattern or practice of wrongdoing. So you think about places like the Cleveland consent decree that say the officers can't pistol whip people. You think about in New Orleans where officers were calling hits on people, or Baltimore where there was clear discriminatory practices, or Ferguson where the police were sicking dogs on people. That the consent decrees bind the police departments and the courts to ensure that there's actual systemic change. And I think Commissioner Davis is right. He is one of the police chiefs that understands that if there will ever be trust between communities and police, that there has to be deep, deep change, and that the consent decrees are one of the clearest tools for that change. Sessions also knows at the end of the consent decrees will mean that we don't have the data to actually do more meaningful reform, and I think that actually is what he's doing here.
Stephen, you represent Cleveland. Go ahead.
Yes, sir. I appreciate being on this panel, and I can tell you this. These consent decrees are very, very dangerous, and there's not a police officer or police agency out here that doesn't always want to move forward and do the best practices. And here in the city of Cleveland, we've done that. What we can't tolerate as police officers is large-scale changes based on false narrative out there. I've heard several times constitutional policing. Okay, sign us up for that. Prove to me that there isn't constitutional policing. That's a subjective conclusion that very divisive organizations are making, very racially exclusive organizations are making. And the fact of the matter is that the police department and the police officers in that department don't care what color the people are that call them. And the people that call us don't care what package we come into. So those are other people's agendas, and it's just not reality out in the street. And it's very, very telling to me when now all of a sudden we have all these mayors and police commissioners and police chiefs embracing these Department of Justice oversight, Obama's Department of Justice oversight, which is very, very dangerous and very, very costly. And the city of Cleveland's going to cost us $7 million to pay the monitors to that. If the Department of Justice wants to come in and demand reform, then the Department of Justice should be paying for that and not taking that money away from the citizens, from the officers on the street.
Let me bring in Mark, and then I know DeRay wants to react. Mark, go ahead.
Well, I just find it interesting that part of what we're talking about is the resistance for the law enforcement community in general to change or to accept change or to evolve even. And I think most importantly that part of the reform movement, the criminal justice reform movement, and in the smaller scale, the police reform movement involves evolving and taking police department, law enforcement agencies to the next level into the 21st century, as Commissioner Davis recognized. And then you have those within law enforcement, and let's be honest about it, in large part, my former colleagues are in large part very fickle, very super sensitive to anything that is new or different than what they are accustomed to. So there will naturally be a resistance. That should not hold up the calls and the need and the obvious need for there to be additional training and resources. And more importantly than just what we call reform is the movement towards professional standards. I think it's high time that we establish and define clear 21st century professional standards across the nation without nationalizing the police department.
And I agree with that.
DeRay, you wanted to speak to Stephen's point that this is too expensive and that officers are not discriminating.
Yeah, to get to a consent decree, there has to have been a proving of a pattern of practice. So in Cleveland, the consent decree literally is like, police officers, you can't pistol whip people. Like if your officers weren't doing that, then there wouldn't be a need for this. And that is what we've seen in Cleveland and in cities across the country. So it's sort of laughable to hear a police union official sort of say that there's no proof of this. Like the only way we got to a consent decree is because there are mountains of evidence that the DOJ has produced. And mind you, that people in communities have been saying this for a long time. So the proof has always been in people's lives, but even the DOJ validated it. You can't just dismiss that.
There wasn't mountains of evidence. There wasn't mountains of evidence. They took 600 reports out of 2.2 million available to them to come to very dangerous and politically motivated conclusions. Barack Obama started this.
So those 600 reports don't matter? Are they just not? They don't count for anything?
No, they're not. No, they're not accurate. Law enforcement across this country. Law enforcement across this country has 1 million contacts with citizens every single day. Every single day in the city of Cleveland, we had 36,000 arrests in 2015.
You don't think there's any change necessary in Cleveland? You think Cleveland is a model city for policing?
Listen, I think that we proved that on an international stage with the RNC, the way we handled the RNC, the way we've handled several protests.
How about the way you handle policing every day? It can't be, your example of great policing can't be a convention for 4 days.
We can't, sure, but we cannot, we do the best that we can do with the resources that we get.
Yeah, which sometimes means that people are killed.
Hold on, okay, let Stephen go ahead. Stephen, Stephen, go ahead.
Thank you, sir. We have politicians now that all of a sudden are embracing this Department of Justice. They're admitting that they mismanaged the police departments across this country for decades. They've reduced budgets 17 years in a row in the city of Cleveland. They reduced spending. We don't have the cars. We don't have the computers in the cars. We want to go to training. I'll go to as much training as you can. If you put 2 police cars in every zone in the city of Cleveland, we will have and we will get back to community-engaged policing, which is what we all want.
So let me go.
So those are
sir, I'm going to pause. I got to manage. So, Monique, I wanted to bring you back in. Speak to Stephen's point that, A, this is too expensive, and that, B, there is, and many officers say there's a duality between the fact that data shows many officers do their job, they never discharge a firearm, they're never involved in any accusation of police brutality, and yet at the same time, what Stephen's calling political is something that independent federal judges appointed by both parties across the country have repeatedly, to DeRay's point, upheld, which is there is documented physical, testimonial, and video evidence of this misconduct. What do you say to all that, Monique, in the road ahead?
Well, I agree that there is documented evidence of unconstitutional policing, and I would like us to put this in perspective a little bit. The Department of Justice has investigated police departments all over the country under one statute in particular, and that statute has been in place for 23 years. In that time, the Department of Justice has investigated only about 70 of the 18,000 law enforcement agencies across the country and has entered into agreements with half of those. So to suggest that the Department of Justice has been overreaching and is doing something that is dangerous to law enforcement is just untrue. In terms of the cost, in Baltimore, over 5 years, the city paid roughly $13 million in settlement agreements between the city and victims of police brutality. And so the cost of a federal monitor to come in and oversee a consent decree that details reforms that the police department should undertake to address the long list of unconstitutional policing is not going to compare to the amount of money that has been used to settle lawsuits. And as a citizen of Baltimore, I am sure that my fellow residents is more willing to spend their taxpayer dollars to prevent a loved one from being killed at the hands of police.
Well,
this segment was, let me tell you folks, this segment was about twice the length of a normal segment we do on the weekends, but still not enough time for obviously the important issues here. I want to thank Monique Dixon, Mark Claxton, DeRay McKesson, and Stephen Loomis, all of you for joining. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much, sir.
Appreciate it. Now, so far, Trump has spent a considerable amount of time away from Washington. You've seen the trips to Mar-a-Lago, where he recently hosted the Chinese president and his wife. But you might be surprised to find out just how much time has piled up in this administration with Trump promoting Trump-branded properties. We've got the numbers straight ahead.